There is a moment in every prolonged confrontation when the tools that were supposed to prevent escalation become the very mechanisms that produce it. When the sanctions designed to compel compliance instead harden resolve. When the military deployments intended to signal deterrence instead signal desperation. When the diplomatic isolation meant to weaken an adversary instead drives it into the arms of powers more capable and more consequential than the adversary itself. The United States and Iran have arrived at that moment after 4 decades of economic warfare, proxy conflict, covert operations, and diplomatic brinkmanship. The confrontation between Washington and Tehran is entering a phase that is qualitatively different from everything that preceded it, not merely more intense, but structurally different in ways that make the familiar instruments of American pressure less effective and the consequences of miscalculation more severe than at any previous point in this long and costly rivalry. Before we go further, if you want to understand the forces shaping this confrontation as they actually operate, stripped of the diplomatic framing and media packaging designed to make a failing strategy appear coherent, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on your notifications. What follows is not a recitation of official positions. It is an honest examination of how we arrived here, what the current phase of this conflict actually represents, and what it means for a world that cannot afford the consequences of getting this wrong. The thesis of everything that follows is this: the transition from sanctions to standoff is not a temporary escalation that careful management will reverse. It is the structural endpoint of a strategic approach that was always more likely to produce confrontation than compliance. Washington bet that sustained economic pressure, applied with sufficient intensity and duration, would eventually force Iranian strategic capitulation. Tehran bet that the costs of resistance, painful as they were lower than the costs of surrender. 40 years of operational history have recorded the outcome of that wager. Iran has not capitulated. Its influence has expanded. Its alliances have deepened. Its military capabilities have advanced, and the confrontation has moved from the relatively manageable domain of economic coercion into the far more dangerous domain of direct military tension, regional proxy warfare, and nuclear brinksmanship. That is the dangerous phase we have now entered. And understanding how we got here is the prerequisite for understanding what comes next. Let us be precise about what this dangerous phase actually consists of, because precision is the enemy of the establishment's preferred vagueness on this question. Iran's nuclear enrichment program has advanced to levels that Western intelligence agencies now describe as unprecedented in the program's history, with uranium enriched to concentrations that have no credible civilian energy justification, and that place Iran at a threshold that nuclear analysts describe with the clinical phrase breakout capability. The International Atomic Energy Agency has reported significant gaps in its monitoring of Iranian nuclear facilities, the result of Iranian restrictions on inspector access that followed the American withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018. The architecture of international verification that was supposed to provide warning time before Iranian nuclear weaponization has been substantially degraded. Simultaneously, Iranian aligned forces across the region have demonstrated an operational tempo and a precision strike capability that has materially altered the security calculations of every government in the Middle East. Houthi forces in Yemen have conducted sustained interdiction operations against Red Sea shipping that have imposed documented, measurable costs on global maritime commerce. Iranian fast attack craft and surveillance vessels have operated in the Strait of Hormuz with a frequency and a boldness that represents a direct challenge to the freedom of navigation that American naval presence in the Gulf is specifically deployed to guarantee. And American military facilities in Iraq and Syria have absorbed dozens of drone and missile strikes from Iranian backed forces over the past 2 years. Strikes calibrated carefully below the threshold of American retaliation, but accumulating into an operational record that tells a story of sustained, systematic pressure on American military presence in the region. This is what the dangerous phase looks like from the inside. Not a single dramatic escalation that triggers a defined response, but a sustained, multi domain pressure campaign conducted across enough theaters simultaneously that the aggregate effect on American credibility, on the economics of American military presence, on the confidence of American allies in the region is greater than any individual incident would suggest. Iran is not stumbling toward confrontation. It is managing escalation with a strategic patience and a tactical sophistication that the establishment's preferred framing of Iranian irrationality has consistently prevented Western analysts from adequately crediting. To understand why this dangerous phase has arrived at this particular moment, we must strip away the narrative of Iranian aggression and confront the historical architecture that produced the current strategic environment. Because the transition from sanctions to standoff was not an accident, it was a predictable outcome of choices made across decades by both sides and by Washington in particular, that closed off the exits from the escalation path one by one until the path itself became the destination. The foundational rupture, as always, is 1953. The CIA orchestrated overthrow of Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, removed from power for insisting that Iranian oil revenues benefit Iranians rather than British and American corporations, established the template for the relationship at its most structurally honest level. Washington would support Iranian governments that served American strategic interests and move against those that did not, regardless of their democratic legitimacy or their compliance with international norms. The Shah's subsequent 26-year reign, sustained by American political and financial support and maintained by the Savak secret police, generated the revolutionary fury of 1979. That revolution was not an eruption of irrational religious extremism. It was the comprehensible reaction of a nation that had watched its democratic experiment crushed and replaced with an American backed police state in exchange for oil concessions. Washington's consistent misreading of 1979 as unprovoked hostility rather than consequential blowback is the original analytical error from which every subsequent strategic miscalculation flows. The 1980s deepened the rupture in ways that Iranian strategic culture cannot process as resolved, and has never been invited to process as resolved through any serious American acknowledgement of responsibility. When Saddam Hussein launched his invasion of Iran in 1980, the United States provided Iraq with satellite battlefield intelligence, political protection at the UN Security Council, and access to the chemical weapon precursors that Saddam deployed against Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians. Washington was not a neutral observer of the war that killed close to 1 million Iranians. It was an active participant, operating through a proxy it would later invade and destroy, in part for the possession of the very weapons whose production American assistance had enabled. The Iranian leadership does not experience this history as ancient grievance. It processes it as foundational operational intelligence about the actual, as distinct from the stated, principles governing American behavior. Intelligence that informs every Iranian calculation about the reliability of American security guarantees and the appropriate level of deterrence investment required to compensate for their absence. The nuclear agreement of 2015 represented the single genuine inflection point in 4 decades at which the trajectory of this confrontation bent toward something other than the standoff we now inhabit. Iran accepted rigorous international inspections and verifiable enrichment limits. The IAEA certified compliance repeatedly and without reservation. The United States withdrew in 2018 not because Iran had violated its obligations, but because a political administration concluded that maximum pressure served its strategic purposes better than verified compliance. The lesson delivered to Tehran and absorbed by every government watching was structurally simple and strategically devastating. American treaty commitments are contingent on American political convenience and cannot serve as reliable foundations for national security planning. The Iranian conclusion that followed, that the diplomatic path offers no durable protection, that the expansion of regional influence and the development of credible deterrence are the only reliable guarantors of Iranian sovereignty, was not irrational. It was the logical product of a lesson that Washington had gone to considerable institutional effort to teach. The failure cascade that has transformed the sanctions campaign into a military standoff is essential to trace in its full scope, because it is this cascade, not Iranian aggression in isolation, that has produced the dangerous phase we are now navigating. Begin with the sanctions architecture itself. 4 decades of progressively intensified economic warfare have not produced Iranian strategic capitulation. They have produced Iranian adaptation at a scale and a sophistication that has fundamentally changed the strategic environment in which the sanctions operate. Iran has constructed a sanctions resistant economic infrastructure, trading in alternative currencies, deepening barter arrangements with willing partners, and integrating with the parallel financial architecture that Russia and China are constructing as a deliberate structural alternative to the Western led international financial system. China purchases Iranian oil in volumes that render the export restrictions substantially less than comprehensive, paying in renminbi through mechanisms that American financial pressure cannot reach, without imposing costs on China that Washington has consistently declined to accept. Russia supplies advanced military technology, air defense systems, electronic warfare capabilities, operational knowledge accumulated across multiple theaters in exchange for Iranian drone technology that has proven its operational value in Ukraine. The sanctions regime, intended to isolate Iran and contract its strategic options, has accelerated Iran's integration into an emerging multipolar economic and security architecture. That architecture is explicitly constructed as a structural alternative to Western financial hegemony, and Iranian participation strengthens both Iran and the architecture simultaneously. Maximum pressure applied simultaneously against Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea has not weakened any of them individually. It has created a community of strategic interest among them whose collective resilience exceeds the coercive capacity directed at any one. The proxy containment failure is equally consequential and equally underreported in establishment discourse. American strategy assumed that Iran's regional network could be degraded through a combination of targeted military pressure on network components and economic coercion of Iran itself. The operational record inverts that assumption with a consistency that has become impossible to attribute to coincidence or circumstance. Hezbollah, subjected to multiple Israeli military campaigns and sustained American and European financial pressure, possesses a larger and more precise missile inventory today than at any previous point in its existence. The Houthis, subjected to years of Saudi led military operations backed by American intelligence and logistical support, control more Yemeni territory and more strategic Red Sea coastline than when those operations began, and have demonstrated a capacity to disrupt global shipping that their adversaries comprehensively failed to anticipate. The popular mobilization forces in Iraq are institutionalized within Iraqi state security structures in ways that make their removal politically impossible without dismantling the Iraqi government itself, a government that American forces spent 2 decades and trillions of dollars constructing. The operational record across every theater where Iranian proxy containment has been attempted produces the same result: a network more capable, more experienced, more deeply embedded in regional political structures, and more institutionally durable than the one the containment strategy was designed to eliminate. The moral authority collapse is the failure that determines how the broader international community reads the confrontation and whose position in the Gulf power struggle the arithmetic of global alignment ultimately validates. Washington frames its posture as the defense of universal principles: nuclear nonproliferation, the sovereign equality of states, freedom of navigation, the protection of small states from regional coercion. Each principle disintegrates on contact with the selective manner of its application. Nuclear non-proliferation is demanded of Iran, while advanced nuclear cooperation is extended to states that have never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and while American arsenals of thousands of warheads are maintained as non-negotiable sovereign instruments, sovereign equality is invoked for Gulf monarchies, while Iranian sovereignty is treated as contingent on compliance with American demands. Freedom of navigation is enforced in waters where American naval presence is itself experienced by Iran as a standing threat to Iranian coastal sovereignty. The global south has not failed to notice the pattern of selective application and the conclusions it has drawn, expressed through trade relationships, diplomatic postures, and the quiet accumulation of hedging arrangements, are reshaping the alignment architecture of the international system in ways that progressively erode the coalition available to sustain American pressure on Tehran. The narrative that the sanctions campaign has been a coherent and effective instrument of American strategic policy is now collapsing against the visible evidence of the confrontation it has produced, and the distance between the official account and the operational reality has become wide enough to constitute its own strategic problem. The official account presents 4 decades of sanctions as a sustained exercise in coercive diplomacy, costly for Iran, successful in limiting Iranian capabilities, and justified as the responsible alternative to direct military conflict. The operational record presents a different picture with considerable clarity. Iran's nuclear program is more advanced today than at any point in its history. Iran's regional influence network is broader, more capable, and more institutionally embedded than when the sanctions began. Iran's alliances with Russia and China are deeper and more operationally significant than at any previous point. Iran's military capabilities, the missile inventories, the drone technology, the naval anti-access doctrine, the shore-based anti-ship missile systems overlooking the Strait of Hormuz have advanced rather than contracted under the pressure designed to degrade them. The gap between the story of successful coercive diplomacy and the operational reality of accelerating Iranian capability and expanding Iranian influence is not a matter of interpretive framing. It is a matter of arithmetic applied to the documented record. The economic consequence of this failed strategy arrives directly at the doorstep of ordinary citizens far removed from the Gulf theater. Houthi interdiction of Red Sea shipping, enabled by Iranian missile and drone technology, has imposed billions of dollars in rerouting and insurance costs on global maritime trade, costs that transmit through supply chains into the price of goods on shelves across the Western world. The cost exchange ratio of American naval operations against Houthi interdiction, expensive interceptor missiles deployed against inexpensive Iranian-designed drones in sustained high-frequency engagements, represents a fiscal pressure on American defense budgets already stretched across multiple simultaneous theaters. A serious military confrontation that triggers Iranian closure of the Strait of Hormuz would remove approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day from global markets, producing an energy price shock. whose magnitude would dwarf the 1973 Arab oil embargo in a global economy far more dependent on continuous energy supply than 1973's was. These are not abstract geopolitical projections. They are the direct economic consequences, measurable in energy prices, shipping costs, and consumer goods inflation, of a confrontation whose management has been comprehensively inadequate to its stakes. The global reckoning triggered by the transition from sanctions to standoff is reshaping international alignments across every dimension of the emerging multipolar order, and its reverberations extend well beyond the Gulf theater, in which the confrontation is most visibly expressed. China's position in this confrontation is the most consequential external variable and the one most systematically mischaracterized in establishment discourse. Beijing brokered the Saudi Iranian diplomatic normalization, the most significant Gulf diplomatic realignment in decades, through a mediation process that bypassed Washington entirely and demonstrated a Chinese capacity for constructive regional diplomacy that the American presence in the Gulf, with its consistent association with instability and coercion, has been unable to match. China purchases Iranian oil, invests in Iranian infrastructure, and conducts joint naval exercises with Russia and Iran in Gulf waters, not because Beijing seeks military confrontation with the United States, but because it seeks a Gulf in which no single external power exercises monopoly control over the energy infrastructure and shipping lanes that Chinese economic security depends upon. A Gulf governed by genuine multipolarity, in which Iranian sovereignty is preserved and American dominance is balanced by the presence of alternative powers, serves Chinese interests more directly than either Iranian collapse or open warfare, both of which would damage Chinese economic interests through energy market disruption. Russia's alignment with Iran reflects a structural convergence of interest that the simultaneous application of maximum pressure to both states has made deeper and more operationally significant with each passing year. Russian military technology flowing to Iran, air defense systems, electronic warfare equipment, operational knowledge strengthens Iranian deterrence against the American action that would remove one of Russia's most strategically important partners. Iranian drone technology flowing to Russia has demonstrated its operational value in Ukraine in ways that have materially affected that conflict's conduct. The relationship is reciprocally reinforcing and actively deepening, and its depth now represents a strategic asset for both parties that American pressure has been unable to sever and has, through its consistent application, actively strengthened. The swing states of the global south, India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Indonesia, are processing the transition from sanctions to standoff as a signal about the trajectory of the American led order and adjusting their alignment calculations accordingly. Saudi Arabia's BRICS membership, the UAE's deepening economic integration with China, alongside its American security partnerships, Turkey's maintenance of functional relations with Iran within the nominal framework of NATO membership. These are not contradictory postures. They are the expressions of a rational hedging strategy adopted by governments that have privately concluded that the American unipolar moment in the Gulf is in terminal decline, and that the intelligent strategic position is the construction of relationships on both sides of the emerging divide before the transition completes itself. The practical consequence for American Gulf strategy is a progressive erosion of the coalition available to sustain pressure on Tehran, an erosion that occurs not through dramatic defection, but through the quiet accumulation of relationships and interests that make full compliance with American preferences increasingly costly and therefore increasingly unlikely. We are standing at the twilight of a strategic approach that has defined American Iran policy since the revolution of 1979. an approach premised on the conviction that sustained economic pressure, military containment, and diplomatic isolation would eventually produce the Iranian strategic capitulation or political collapse that would resolve the confrontation on American terms. That premise has been tested against operational reality for 4 decades. The verdict of those 4 decades is unambiguous. The approach has failed by every measure that matters. Iranian nuclear advancement, Iranian regional influence, Iranian alliance depth, and Iranian military capability are all greater today than they were when the approach was adopted. The confrontation has not been managed toward resolution. It has been escalated toward the dangerous phase we now inhabit. The United States faces a binary choice whose terms the accumulation of failure has made starker and more urgent than at any previous point in this confrontation. The first path is genuine strategic realism, the difficult institutional acknowledgement that the instruments of maximum pressure have failed to achieve their stated objectives, and that the only path to a stable regional order is one that accommodates Iranian interests within a negotiated framework rather than pursuing Iranian strategic defeat through a policy toolkit whose consistent failure the operational record has comprehensively documented. This path requires returning to diplomacy with the seriousness and the flexibility that the post 2018 American approach has conspicuously lacked, offering Iran the verifiable security guarantees and economic normalization that might make the continued expansion of its deterrence network strategically unnecessary. Treating Iran as the significant regional power it demonstrably is, and building a Gulf security architecture that reflects the actual distribution of regional power rather than the distribution that American strategic preference would impose. This is not a comfortable path. It requires powerful institutions to acknowledge that their preferred strategy has failed and that their strategic map no longer matches the territory. Those are demands that powerful institutions resist with formidable tenacity. But this path exists, and it is the only one the operational record suggests leads somewhere other than a confrontation that neither side has a credible plan to control. The second path is the one that institutional momentum, political incentive, and the accumulated cultural assumptions of the American foreign policy establishment have made the default: more sanctions, more carrier deployments, more covert operations, more of precisely the instruments that have produced precisely the dangerous phase now unfolding. This is not strategy in any meaningful sense. It is the institutional inertia of a system that has confused the continuation of familiar activity with the exercise of strategic judgment, and that applies failed instruments because the cost of acknowledging their failure, measured in institutional prestige, political capital, and the disruption of careers and worldviews built around the failed approach, exceeds, within the system's internal accounting, the cost of continuing to apply them. The costs that do not appear in that internal accounting are the ones paid by ordinary people in energy prices, in economic instability, in the risk of a military confrontation, in the world's most consequential energy waterway that nobody is positioned to fully control once it begins. Tragically, every signal from Washington's institutional architecture suggests the second path is the one being walked by default. The political system rewards toughness and penalizes concession. The defense industry structural incentives favor sustained military engagement. The think tanks and media infrastructure that shape elite opinion have spent decades constructing a worldview in which Iranian influence is inherently illegitimate and its containment inherently necessary. Regardless of what the operational record of containment reveals, the people operating within these structures are not reckless individuals. They are capable professionals operating with a strategic map that no longer matches the territory, and the system has not yet generated the institutional capacity to replace it with one that does. That gap between the map and the territory is the dangerous phase. and it is the phase we are now in. History records outcomes, not intentions. It does not award credit for the sincerity of a failed strategy or the diligence with which ineffective instruments were applied. The transition from sanctions to standoff is history's current entry in the canon record of this confrontation, a clear and unambiguous signal that the approach has reached its limits and that the territory ahead is more dangerous than the territory behind. The question that remains open is whether the institutions with the power to change course retain the capacity for the strategic honesty that change requires. The answer to that question will determine whether the dangerous phase resolves through the difficult but survivable path of strategic revision, or through the catastrophic and far more costly path of a confrontation that the operational record suggests nobody is prepared to manage. That is the truth of where this confrontation stands. It is the analysis that this channel exists to deliver clearly, honestly, and without the filter of those who profit from your managed ignorance of it. If this has given you a more honest and more complete picture of what the transition from sanctions to standoff actually represents, subscribe to this channel, turn on your notifications, and share this video with someone who deserves to understand what is happening before the consequences arrive. The algorithm suppresses this kind of analysis precisely because it challenges the official account, and the only way it reaches the people who need it is if you carry it to them. Leave your answers in the comments below. First, do you believe the dangerous phase of the US Iran conflict now makes a direct military confrontation more likely than a negotiated resolution? Or is there still a genuine diplomatic path that neither side has seriously pursued? And second, given 40 years of documented failure by the sanctions approach, what would a genuinely realistic American Iran policy actually look like? And is the current political system capable of producing it? Write your answers. The debate belongs to you.